Professor Caroline Wilkinson took up the post of Director at the Liverpool School of Art and Design in October 2014. She has a background in art and science, and her research and creative work sits at the forefront of art and science fusion and includes subjects as diverse as forensic art, human anatomy, medical art, facial recognition, anthropology, 3D visualisation and craniofacial identification. Caroline is the director of the Face Lab, an LJMU research group based in Liverpool Science Park. The Face Lab carries out forensic and archaeological research and consultancy work, including craniofacial analysis, facial depiction and forensic art. Craniofacial depiction from skeletal remains utilises anatomical standards and anthropometry to ensure the methodology of facial feature prediction is rigorous and reliable. However, the addition of skin colour, hair colour, expression, clothing and hairstyle is reliant on historical knowledge, DNA analysis and artistic interpretation, and this may be influenced by preconceived ideas and context. Professor Wilkinson will discuss the cognitive bias associated with the depiction of faces from the past and how this might also affect forensic investigation. And I hand over to Professor Caroline Wilkinson.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much again for coming today. So I thought I would try and raise a few questions really, rather than give you some answers. Try and raise some questions in relation to the cognitive bias that we have in relation to the work that we produce in Face Lab. So in Face Lab we interpret skeletal remains in order to depict the faces of people who are dead. And we do that for a number of reasons, one of which is for forensic investigation, to identify people for the police or to help identify people with the police, and within archaeological investigation, so bringing the faces of people from the past back to life, if you like, in terms of appearance, so that that can be exhibited, or so that we can understand people living from different periods of time. But what I want to talk about first of all really is the importance of the face and how we have cognitive bias anyway in relation to all of our dealings with facial appearance. It's hard to overstate the importance of the face, socially, physically, psychologically. We use it within social communication on a daily basis. It's important to us in terms of our identity. We change our faces throughout our lifetime whilst keeping them mostly within an identifying template once we get to adulthood. And we can choose to present our faces in a number of ways depending on our culture, our personality, how we feel that particular day. So our face is incredibly important for holding elements of gender, elements of age representation, our ancestry, our ethnic group. It holds individual expression, and we use it on a daily basis for verifying and authenticating our identity and for changing our identity as well. So we use it as a way of documenting our identity within facial images. So it's incredibly important, the face, within our world and within our own personal identity. But we also make huge perception errors on a daily basis in relation to people and their faces. We know that the face is key to whether we judge someone attractive or not. The facial appearance is incredibly important to that. These are the two most beautiful faces created by a research group at the University of Sussex, along with generated by Samsung funding. These two images were produced as the most beautiful white European faces as judged by the general public. And much of that is to do with symmetry and youth, sadly, but some of it is not. But what we know about attractiveness is that we have a huge cognitive bias in relation to it. So when we look at people who we consider to be attractive, we give them in our minds much better personality traits than we give to somebody who we consider not to be attractive. We know that people who have dental malocclusion problems or abnormalities are considered to be more likely criminals and more likely not nice people than people who are considered to have attractive faces. Clearly this is not true. This is our cognitive bias towards those individuals. If you're attractive, you will end up having a higher status in life. You're more likely to have a higher income than someone who's not attractive. You're more likely to be convicted of a crime than someone who's attractive. If you're convicted of a crime, you're more likely to be given a shorter sentence if you're attractive than if you're unattractive. Attractive children are given better marks by their teachers than unattractive children, despite their level of intelligence. We have a huge amount of bias towards attractive people in society. We also know that leaders are more likely to display those facial traits that are considered attractive and more likely to be voted in, elected as leaders, and that people who have strong facial traits are considered to be, are more likely to have a higher status by the time they reach middle age than people who have not. So our face is incredibly important in our lifetime of how we reach and our achievements and reach our successes. From our point of view, and these are connected, I promise, what we're trying to do is to interpret what somebody looked like by looking at their skull, at their skeletal remains. We do that following quite rigorous now anatomical standards. We've always, within FaceLab, which is a large group, and all of the work you see is not just mine, it belongs to the whole FaceLab team. We've always worked on these boundaries between art and science. Many of the people in the group come from an artistic background and others come from a very scientific background. But we follow quite rigorous anatomical standards for predicting facial appearance, whether that's within a forensic investigation to help the police identify human remains, or whether it's within an archaeological setting where we're depicting the face of somebody from a particular period of time from a particular part of the world. As you can see, we can make quite realistic, non-real faces. These are not images of real people, but they're quite realistic images from our skeletal assessment. So then I wanted to talk about the cognitive bias in relation to this kind of work. And there's a recent case that came about with some new DNA evidence that surfaced in relation to Cheddar Man. So Cheddar Man is a Mesolithic set of human remains from the UK, the oldest set of human remains from the UK, from Cheddar Gorge. And over the years, they were found some time ago, but over the years, there have been a number of depictions of Cheddar Man. The first one produced by Richard Neve from the University of Manchester in the 1990s. Recently, some DNA analysis was carried out, and it was discovered that Cheddar Man has DNA status that suggests he had dark skin, much more common type of skin from a sub-Saharan African group, but pale blue eyes and dark hair. This is very different to the depiction that was first produced of Cheddar Man, where it was assumed that pale skin came into Europe 45,000 years ago along with pale eyes. We now know, because of this DNA analysis, that in fact pale eyes must have arrived into Europe before the dark skin, and that's why the depiction is quite different. But it gives you an idea of how changing knowledge can lead to a change in depiction and interpretation. Nothing demonstrates the historical change in knowledge better than the depiction of Neanderthals. So Neanderthals have been depicted since 1908, when the first remains were interpreted. When they were first interpreted, it was assumed that they were very ape-like, that they weren't like humans at all, that they were some sort of early version of man, and they were given very hairy bodies, hairy faces, and very ape-like. Also, the first set of remains from France, we now know had arthritis, but it was assumed that was the position of the limbs and that they had this ape-like quality and movement to them. In the 1920s and 30s, Some more remains were found which suggested that they had a different kind of body stature, but still they were considered to be very brute-like, very ugly. These are the depictions from the 1920s and 30s in the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. In the 1980s, some remains were found in Iraq, which were found with flowers, or remains of flowers, suggesting a ceremonial tradition, which also suggested that they were much more community and communicative animals than first thought, or versions of us first thought. So then the depictions of Neanderthals became much more social, but still quite primitive. And then recent interpretations of Neanderthal have made them much more human, with the knowledge in 2010 that 4% of current human genes are from Neanderthal, and the Max Planck Institute knowledge that there was interbreeding between Neanderthal and early man means that they have been depicted as more like us, as more human-like. And the very latest depictions of them are giving them personality and expression and character as well, and bringing them much more up to date to be like humans. So this gives you a very good indication of how contextual bias and our knowledge can change the way that we interpret human remains. So that leads us on to the work that we do within FaceLab, looking at more contemporary archaeological investigations and what kind of knowledge we really have. We know from the experiments that we've carried out how accurate we are at predicting shape. We know that following anatomical standards, when we compare the surface of the reconstruction with the surface of an actual face, that we're about 70% of the face has less than 2 millimeters of error. So we know exactly how accurate we are at predicting shape, and we're pretty confident in our ability to predict shape at this stage. The problem for us really is that everything after that is mostly guesswork. We mostly don't know skin colour and eye colour. We don't know whether someone has wrinkles or moles. We don't know how they wore their hair, even if we do know the colour. There are lots of things about a face that we don't know from looking at skeletal remains. And after being quite preoccupied in my research with conquering our ability to predict shape, I've now become more preoccupied with how we can make those faces look realistic and how reliable we are at predicting texture, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do. In forensic investigation, we are more likely to put faces into the public domain like this. So in black and white, so that we're not attempting to guess colour. We'll often blur areas that we're less confident in, like hairstyle. With men, we often cut the top of the head off because we know it doesn't make any difference to identification, and we don't therefore have to guess whether or not they've gone bald. So it allows us to be able to put out information that focuses on the area of the face that we hope will lead to an identification. But within archaeology, we have a whole different set of circumstances that means we're looking for the most likely appearance. It's possible now to get quite a lot of additional information through DNA analysis, and there's a lot of work that's been carried out aligning DNA to eye colour, to hair colour, to the type of skin, whether it's freckly or not, that someone may have. And this is somewhat typical, not so much in the UK, but becoming more common to have in a forensic investigation or an archaeological investigation some information like this. That allows us to be able to predict eye colour and hair colour and skin colour based on genetic variants. And in a forensic case, it might be possible to produce something like this, which is a kind of card showing the biological profile of an individual in relation to eye colour, skin colour, freckles, baldness, aspects like that might help with any depiction. The problem with that is that some of that information is useful and some of it is not very useful. So it's useful for us to know skin colour, admittedly. It's useful for us to know eye colour, because those two things are quite difficult to change. Hair is a different kettle of fish altogether. If you look around a mostly 20-year-old age group of individuals now, probably the majority of people in the room will not have the hair colour that they were born with, will not have their natural hair colour, myself included. So We colour our hair, we dye it, we change it on a daily basis. We change the way we look, or it's possible to do that on a daily basis. The other thing is that DNA often gives you the colour of the hair that someone had as a child. So in the Richard III investigation that I was involved in, that I'll talk about a little bit, we were told that he had blonde hair as a child. Now that applies to a huge number of people from a white European population, the Queen being one of them, who you would not describe as being a blonde adult any stretch of the imagination. So knowing what the hair colour of somebody was as a child is not terribly useful in terms of identification. It's especially not useful if they change the colour of their hair deliberately, and it's also not very useful in later life when people go grey or go white-haired or may lose their hair and go bald. Not very useful to us to know what colour their hair is if it's not there at all. And that can be very important for identification. Also, knowing the hair colour that somebody has, or even the type of hair that they have, doesn't tell us how they wore their hair, and that can have a huge effect in relation to their facial appearance, whether or not they wear their hair down or up, whether it's curly or straight. And facial hair, of course, can have a massive effect in terms of facial appearance and identity as well. So some things we can get from DNA are important, and other things are somewhat problematic for us in terms of identification. So I'll just show you a few archaeological investigations just to show you the problems that we have both with our own cognitive bias and also the bias of those looking at the images. Well, and I'll start with that. This is a reconstruction that we did a few years ago when I was at the University of Dundee of Johann Sebastian Bach, the famous composer. His remains, his skull was scanned that we used for the reconstruction, and then the Haussmann portrait that you can see there, which we know he sat in front of the artist who painted it, was used to take his skin colours and his eye colour, etc., in order to texture the head. Now, in all of the portraits of Bach, he's wearing a wig, which was common, so we have no idea what was happening underneath that wig. Certainly if he had hair, he would have cropped it short, but we don't know if he had hair, he could have been completely bald. So the least accurate part of this reconstruction, this depiction, is the hair. But everything else was taken in detail from the Haussmann portrait and from the skeletal remains and from the written descriptions of him in terms of the weight that he carried and the eye swelling that he suffered from during his adulthood. This is the Guardian's response to this reconstruction. I was living in Scotland at the time, working as an academic at the University of Dundee. As you can hear, I'm not Scottish, but the Guardian assumed that we had made him look Scottish when we did this reconstruction, somehow. Because I think they described him, yeah, there you go, as a Motherwell boozer, which is hilarious, both in the sense of what we'd produced, which is significantly less boozy looking than the Haussmann portrait, I would say, but also gives you some sense of the response that people have to these famous historical figures if they have some sort of investment in how that person looked and how we have interpreted that and presented it. Another good example, of course, is Richard III. Again, this was some work that I produced when I was at the University of Dundee with the team there. Worked with a number of people, including the University of Leicester. This was produced before the DNA results had positively identified his remains as Richard III. So we knew the circumstances, we knew it was likely that it was him, circumstantially, but we didn't know for sure, and we had to produce the reconstruction following our scientific standards so that we could justify all the decisions that we made, because I knew that this was going to be high profile and we would have to be able to justify it. We don't have very many descriptions of Richard III from people who actually met him. And these are the descriptions we do have by people who actually met him, and none of them are very helpful. They talk about his build, his stature being quite slender. They talk about him having one shoulder higher than the other. Some of them talk about him being born with teeth and hair on his shoulders, presumably not teeth. And some of them talk about him being not as handsome as his brother, which is not very helpful either. So we don't have a huge amount to go on in terms of what's known about his appearance. There are portraits of Richard III. One of them dates from 50 years after he died and the other from 150 years after he died. So neither of these were painted during his life. They may have been painted using portraits that were painted during his life as reference, but if they did that, we no longer have those, so we don't know that that's the case. But we of course know these, and we know they were painted after his death, and we know that there was a whole propaganda perhaps associated with how he was depicted because of his because of him losing a battle, and history is always written by the winners. We also know the Shakespearean description of Richard III as a crooked monster with a hunchback and a withered arm. That's been demonstrated a number of times in theatre, but all of these are propagandist views of Richard III to some extent. And what we had to work on with the skull, so we followed the same scientific anatomical process as we do for all of the reconstructions. He has one shoulder higher than the other because he had scoliosis, and that was determined from the spine. And then at this stage, we discovered that the DNA had been positively identified as being Richard III. And then the portraits were used in order to take the skin colour, the eye colour, the hairstyle, the clothing, the hat, etc. that he was worn in order to interpret that further to depict him in an as realistic way as possible. One of the things that this did, I think, in relation to history and in relation to the people who are interested in this particular period, is to show him in a completely different way. Or to us, it just seemed like a relatively neutral face, which is what we try to do for all of our archaeological investigations, because we don't want to be suggesting personality through expression, so we tend to do a relatively relaxed but neutral face when we're presenting people from the past. To the people who really care about Richard III, of which there are thousands it would seem, this was in some way a justification of him being not the evil monster that he'd been depicted as, and him being normal and just like everybody else, which in itself is an interpretation of something that really is just an anatomical shape. There then was a second iteration of Richard III because the DNA results came back saying that he was blonde as a child and therefore light brown haired as an adult, and his eyes were much paler than we thought from looking at the portraits. So we replaced those. It's exactly the same head, but we replaced the eyes and the hair and the eyelashes and the eyebrows, but everything else stayed the same. And that's how he looks now in the Richard III Visitor Centre. And then finally, just one last one to talk about is a depiction that we carried out of Robert the Bruce. And this is interesting because there are a number of things that we might be biased by in relation to Robert the Bruce. So he's an incredibly important Scottish historic figure. He was voted the third most important Scot ever in a Scottish poll in 2006, beaten only by Robert Burns and somebody else, William Wallace, thank you. And we know from what's written about him what an incredibly strong leader he was. He had a huge status right up to his death. He was still acting as a very strong ruler right up to the moment he died. And there are no recorded descriptions of him in terms of facial appearance at all, and no portraits of him contemporary to him at all. So we have no idea about what he looks like other than the much more contemporary to us portraits and sculptures that have been carried out. There is a school of thought that he had leprosy, that he suffered from leprosy in the last part of his life and died with leprosy. If he did have leprosy, then surely this would have affected his status as an incredibly strong leader and king. And if we're going to interpret the leprosy, that had to be taken into account. And we worked with a historian, a number of historians actually, and geneticists to get to the final depictions. The anatomical part is really straightforward, follows exactly the same process as always. Mark is our incredibly skillful CGI and texture expert. So what he can do is to take the 3D shape of the head that's produced and wrap very realistic skin textures around that shape to create a very realistic 3D image of the head. At this stage, we then had to start making decisions about what textures we added, what skin colour and eye colour, etc. we added. We know he's a Scottish king, and we know what period of time he was alive during, and we know what some of his descendants looked like, and we know what some of his ancestors have been described as looking like in written text, but we don't know about him at all. The general consensus from the historians at the time, to start with, was that they wanted him to be ginger-haired and blue-eyed. And this is entirely the whole Scottish historic, Scottish historic figure and the importance of that and what that means to Scotland. We started doing that and then thought better of it and consulted with a few geneticists who looked at his descendants in terms of their portraits and how they were depicted, and looked at what was written about and what was known about his ancestors, and statistically worked out his most likely hair colour, skin colour and eye colour based on that. And it is in fact brown-eyed and brown-haired is the most likely statistically. So that's what he was given. We then had to make a decision about the leprosy. So the historian we worked with, Martin McGregor from Glasgow University, was absolutely adamant that this could not have been noticed, this leprosy. People mustn't have known that he had it during his life because it would have had such a strong effect on his status, and it would have been used by the English as a way of denigrating his status, which they didn't really do, and it was mentioned after he died, but not in the same way. There are some historians who think he didn't have leprosy, and we will never know because we're working on a skull cast, and without the actual remains we'll never know whether he had leprosy or not. So we made another depiction with him showing signs of leprosy on his face, but in a very mild presentation that could have been not so much hidden but not as much noticed in medieval Scotland, that wouldn't have detracted from his status. We then also worked with armoury experts who gave us the information about the armour as well. We may need to do further iterations of this. There's some debate as to whether or not he had facial hair. Seems not is the most likely. But this just gives you an indication of the problems we have with trying to predict all of this. Once we've done the shape, you'd think it'd be relatively easy. Actually, this part is much more difficult because there's so much bias to us in terms of who the person was, but also in our expectations of what their skin colour, eye colour and hairstyle may have been. The last thing I'm going to talk about is where we are now in terms of our technology. So we often produce animations. This is one of Ramesses II, just showing him mummified and then with his face. There are whole problems of cognitive bias with this because the animation, people who did the CGI made him look European. He's an ancient Egyptian. But anyway, that aside. We often produce animations, but the animations are of the process or of the head turning. What we now want to be able to do, and what it's now possible for us to do, is to collect 4D data from individuals and apply that to historical cases. So in other words, to collect, this is a colleague from Dundee just saying a few words, and this is the build-up of data from his shape through the non-coloured texture, and then the final thing you see is the coloured texture, to collect both shape, texture and movement in relation to individuals. So if we can take movement and texture and map that onto a different shape, then it's possible that we can have Richard III talking or Robert the Bruce speaking one of his own letters. That's the idea, to do this animation. And we started to do that recently with Robert Burns. We produced a depiction quite a number of years ago now of Robert Burns from the skull in Dumfries and from some portraits. But we also worked with this poet called Rab Wilson, who has always wanted to try and animate the Burns head. And it's only really in the last couple of years that technology has moved on enough to enable us to be able to do this. So what we did was we collected Rab speaking a Burns poem with his facial expressions. We collected that in 4D and then mapped that onto something in between, a template in between Rab and the Burns head, and then moved the Burns head and texture to follow Rab's movements and voice.
Nest with the plough, November 1785.
It's just a snatch I'm going to show you, not the whole thing, don't worry.
Sleekit, coor and timorous beastie. Oh, what a panic's in thy breastie. Thou needn't start away sae hasty with bickering brattle. I would believe to run and chase thee with muttering pattle.
So what we've done really is to try and produce the most authentic voice, accent, interpretation of a Burns poem. We found the shortest one to a mouse, which is 2 minutes long, because it's quite costly producing this, and mapped that so that we could see the Burns head talking with the voice of Rab. Now this introduces a whole new set of ethical issues for us, because what we're doing, I've known Rab for a number of years. I can see that picture of Robert Burns speaking and see Rab in there, even though none of his face is in there in terms of textures and none of his face is in there in terms of shape. I can tell it's Rab because I'm so familiar with his facial expressions and movements, and of course his voice, but even without the voice, you can see that it's him. So what we're doing is it's possible now for us to take the movements and voice of maybe 2 or 3 people, so voice of one, the movements of another, the texture of someone else, and put them onto a head and have a mishmash of 3 different identities to make up one identity of a historical figure. It's possible for Richard III to be made up of one actor's voice, another actor's textures, and another actor's movements to get the finished head. Or it's possible to just use one person and completely morph them into the personality and identity of another. And that creates a whole host of problems for us, I think, ethically. 1, whether it's right to do that, but 2, how scientifically accurate it is to do that, and 3, what the purpose of it is in relation to historical investigation. So I'll leave that with you to make your own minds up. Thank you very much.